Episode 74. Tomatoes grow like bunches of grapes. Rhubarb and strawberries growing together like sisters. Tiger lily season like fireworks. Mid-June in Pawtuxet. Greetings and welcome into the Pawtuxet General. I am your host, Jess. This week, the alcohol level is high. We'll talk about the original zombie. It had a drop of absinthe in it, believe it or not. We'll also discuss my favorite summer treat, fried clams. Done right, they are crispy, sweet, and tender, made for ice-cold tartar sauce. Summer in a dish. Then, we have the continued reading of The Shunned House by H.P. Lovecraft in our House on the Corner series. But first, I must thank our Patreon subscribers. These farm-fresh folks are the strawberries, rhubarb, sugar, lemon juice, mint, perseverance, and good intentions that is the jam we call the Pawtuxet General, without whom we would just be an empty jar. So thank you. If you would like to become one of these begging for toast and butter folks, look for our page on patreon.com or simply follow the links in the show notes. Thank you. Let me introduce you to Pop's clamshell and fried clams. One summer dish most die-hard New Englanders agree tops the rest, and at least for me, is the whole belly fried clam roll. Every summer while I was growing up, either my sister and I or the whole family went up to Alton Bay, New Hampshire. My grandparents had a trailer up some family-owned property on Lake Winnipesaukee. My sister and I stayed barefoot from the last week of June until camp up the street in August, putting aside 2 weeks in Cumberland, Rhode Island for vacation Bible school. We were not allowed to swim in the lake until the 4th of July, but the joys of lake life were innumerable. I most recall waking up to balsam-scented, chilled morning breezes in the plaid LL Bean sleeping bags, staring out the screened back end of the VW camper van as dawn crept in. I would silently watch the woods around us and listen for the campground sounds of the day to start. But most of all, the smells of coffee and bacon. That meant that either Grammy or the aunties were up and making breakfast. I had a need to get into the lake water, fishing, canoeing, but usually sitting in the water reading a book for days or perhaps weeks. This routine was only broken up by changes in books or trips to Alton Bay to Pop's clamshell. My grandfather and us kids got a hot dog or hamburger. I loved the onion rings, which was the only way to get me to eat onions as a child. But really, we went to Pop's for Grammy to get a fried clam roll, golden brown, steaming hot fried clams in a grilled hot dog bun with tartar sauce on the side, and don't forget the tiny plastic cup of coleslaw. The smell was so tantalizing that it made me hungry even though it wasn't my dinner. Pop's clamshell opened in 1945 in Alton Bay, New Hampshire, 03810. Now don't try to go there on Tuesdays or Wednesdays though, they are closed. Open only on the weekends during the off-season, which is any month other than July and August. They have short summers in those parts. So that is the benchmark for fried clams. But down here in RI, I frequent Stadium Fish and Chips on Park Avenue in Cranston. If you want to make your own, you might want to check out Fried Clams Wicked Good Eats on YouTube for a local step-by-step guide. But I have a quite good recipe for you right now from Epicurious. This recipe calls for 4 cups of clams, which is easy enough to procure at any fishmonger in New England, either already shucked or in the shell. For our purposes, let's assume ours are already shucked and trimmed. For this recipe, you will need 1 cup all-purpose flour, 6 large eggs, 3 cups cracker meal. If you can't find cracker meal, you can make your own. Pulse saltine crackers in a food processor to very fine crumbs. Put the crumbs through a coarse strainer to remove any large pieces. An 8-ounce box of crackers will make about 2 1/4 cups of cracker meal. You will also need 1/2 cup fine dry breadcrumbs, 2 tablespoons cornmeal, 2 teaspoons Old Bay seasoning, 2 pounds or about 4 cups of clams, your favorite oil for frying, and tartar sauce. Line a baking sheet with wax paper. Set up what we call standard breading procedure. Put the flour in a shallow bowl, put the eggs in a second shallow bowl, and beat them with a fork. Put the cracker meal, breadcrumbs, cornmeal, and Old Bay seasoning in a third shallow bowl and whisk to combine. Spread the clams out on several layers of paper towels and blot them as dry as possible. Heat about 3 inches of your frying oil in a large saucepan over medium-high heat to 350 degrees. Toss the clams in the flour and shake off any excess. Dip the clams into the egg, coating them completely. Then lift them out by the handful and let any excess egg drop off. Then put the clams into the breading mixture and toss to coat them completely. Keep one hand dry and use the other hand for wet. Transfer to the baking sheet. If the breading starts to clump, put it through a coarse sieve. Then fry the clams in small batches. Crowding the pan will lower the temperature of the oil and the clams will come out greasy. Now cook them until golden brown about 1 minute. Drain on paper towels. Pile the clams on 4 dinner plates and serve with individual bowls of tartar sauce and some fries. Or you could just buy them at your neighborhood clam shack. Either way, enjoy. Why is it called a zombie cocktail? The most well-known origin story of the cocktail's name suggests that Don Beach created the zombie in an attempt to cure the hangover of one of his regulars. When Beach later asked how his cure had worked, the customer allegedly said it made him feel like a zombie. Don Beach, who is well known as Don the Beachcomber. Now, what is the alcohol content of a zombie cocktail? 4 ounces of spirit. One of the ounces is overproof spirit. The original zombie recipe makes a potent cocktail, more than double the alcohol content of the typical classic cocktail recipe. The combined liquid components of the zombie clock in at around 32% ABV by themselves, depending on the exact brand of rums used. However, blending with 6 ounces of crushed ice, as the recipe states, brings the final ABV of the drink down to a more manageable 16 to 20% ABV. Now here is the recipe for the original Don's Mix that you will need for the zombie rum cocktail. Bring 3 crushed cinnamon sticks, 1 cup sugar, and 1 cup water to a boil, stirring until the sugar is completely dissolved. Simmer for 2 minutes, then remove from the heat and let sit for at least 2 hours before straining into a clean glass bottle. Finish the mix. Add 1 part of the syrup and 2 parts fresh grapefruit juice. Cover and keep refrigerated for up to 2 weeks. For this cocktail, you will need 1½ ounces Jamaican rum, 1½ ounces Puerto Rican gold rum, 1 ounce 151 proof Demerara rum, 3/4 of an ounce lime juice freshly squeezed, 1/2 ounce Don's Mix, 1/2 ounce Falner rum, 1 teaspoon grenadine, 4 dashes Pernod, 1 dash Angostura bitters, and garnish with a mint sprig. Add the Jamaican rum, Puerto Rican gold rum, Demerara rum, Pernod, lime juice, Don's Mix, Falner rum, grenadine, and bitters into a blender. Then add 6 ounces of crushed ice. Blend at high speed for no more than 5 seconds. Pour the contents into a tall glass or tiki mug and add additional ice to fill. Then garnish with a mint sprig and Hail Mary. Enjoy Zombie Rum Cocktail.
I want to tell you about my friend Mike and his Electromagnetic Pinball Museum and Restoration Arcade. It's an all-inclusive place to relax and share anything related to modern pinball, EM pinball, and arcade games. A group of pinball and arcade fans with an addiction to games of all kinds and Lego too. $10 gets you free play on pinball and arcade games all day. You can find them at 881 Main Street, Pawtucket, Rhode Island, or online at www.electromagneticpinballmuseum.com.
And now in our House on the Corner series, the continued reading of The Shunned House by H.P. Lovecraft, Chapter 3. It may well be imagined how powerfully I was affected by the annals of the Harrises. In this continuous record, there seemed to me to brood a persistent evil beyond anything in nature as I had known it. An evil clearly connected with the house, and yet not with the family. This impression was confirmed by my uncle's less systematic array of miscellaneous data, legends transcribed from servant gossip, cuttings from the papers, copies of death certificates by fellow physicians, and the like. All of this material I cannot hope to give, for my uncle was a tireless antiquarian and very deeply interested in the Shunned House. But I may refer to several dominant points which earn notice by their reoccurrence through many reports from diverse sources. For example, the servant gossip was practically unanimous in attributing to the fungus in the malodorous cellar of the house a vast supremacy of the evil influence. There had been servants, and White especially, who would not use the cellar kitchen, and at least 3 well-defined legends bore upon the queer quasi-human or diabolic outlines assumed by tree roots and patches of mold in that region. These latter narratives interested me profoundly on account of what I had seen in my boyhood. But I felt that most of the significance had in each case been largely obscured by additions from the common stock of local ghost lore. Anne White, with her Exeter superstition, had promulgated the most extravagant and at the same time most consistent tale, alleging that there must lie buried beneath the house one of those vampires, the dead who retain their bodily form and live on the blood or breath of the living, whose hideous legions send their preying shapes or spirits abroad by night. To destroy a vampire, one must, the grandmothers say, exhume it and burn its heart, or at least drive a stake through that organ. And Anne's dogged insistence that a search under the cellar had been prominent in bringing about her discharge. Her tales, however, commanded a wide audience, and they were more readily accepted because the house indeed stood on land once used for burial purposes. To me, their interest depended less on this circumstance than on the peculiarly appropriate way in which they dovetailed with certain other things. The complaint of the departing servant, Preserved Smith, who had preceded Anna and never heard of her, that something sucked his breath at night, the death certificates of fever victims of 1804, issued by Dr. Chad Hopkins, and showing the 4 deceased persons all accountably lacking in blood, and the obscure passages of poor Rhodey Harris's ravings, where she complained of the sharp teeth of a glassy-eyed, half-visible presence. Free from unwarranted superstition though I am, these things produced in me an odd sensation, which was intensified by a pair of widely separated newspaper cuttings relating to deaths in the Shunned House. One from the Providence Gazette and Country Journal of April 12, 1815, and the other from the Daily Transcript and Chronicle of October 27, 1845. Each of which detailed an appalling, grisly circumstance whose duplication was remarkable. It seems that in both instances the dying person, in 1815 a gentle old lady named Stafford, and in 1845 a school teacher of middle age named Eleazar Durfee, became transfigured in a horrible way, glaring glassily and attempting to bite the throat of the attending physician. Even more puzzling, though, was the final case which put an end to the renting of the house, a series of anemia deaths preceded by a progressive madness wherein the patient would craftily attempt the lives of his relatives by incisions in the neck or wrist. This was in 1860 and 1861, when my uncle had just begun his medical practice, and before leaving for the front, he heard much of it from his elder professional colleagues. The really inexplicable thing was the way in which the victims, ignorant people, for the ill-smelling and widely shunned house could now be rented by no others, would babble maledictions in French, a language they could not possibly have studied to any extent. It made one think of poor Rhody Harris nearly a century before, and so moved my uncle that he commenced collecting historical data on the house after listening, sometimes subsequent from his returning to the war, to the first-hand account of Doctors Chase and Whitmarsh. Indeed, I could see that my uncle had thought deeply on the subject, and that he was glad of my own interest, an open-minded and sympathetic interest, which enabled him to discuss with me matters at which others would merely have laughed. His fancy had not gone as far as mine, but he felt that the place was rare in its imaginative potentialities, and worthy of note as an inspiration in the field of the grotesque and the macabre. For my part, I was disposed to take on the whole subject with profound seriousness, and began at once not only to review the evidence, but to accumulate as much more as I could. I talked with the elderly Archer Harris, then owner of the house, many times before his death in 1916, and obtained from him and his still surviving maiden sister Alice an authentic corroboration of all the family data my uncle had collected. When, however, I asked them what connection with France or its language the house could have, they confessed themselves as frankly baffled and ignorant as I. Archer knew nothing, and all that Miss Harris could say was that an old illusion her grandfather, Dutay Harris, had heard of might shed a little light. The old seaman who had survived his son Welcome's death in battle by 2 years had not himself known the legend, but recalled that his earliest nurse, the ancient Maria Robbins, seemed darkly aware of something that might have lent a weird significance to the French ravings of Rhody Harris, which she had heard so often during the last days of that hapless woman. Maria had been at the Shunned House from 1769 until the removal of the family in 1783, and had seen Mercy Dexter die. Once she hinted to the child Dutay of a somewhat peculiar circumstance in Mercy's last moments, but he had soon forgotten all about it, save that it was something peculiar. The granddaughter, moreover, recalled even this much with difficulty. She and her brother were not so much interested in the house as was Archer's son, Carrington, the present owner, with whom I talked after my experience. Having exhausted the Harris family of all the information it could furnish, I turned my attention to early town records and deeds with a zeal more penetrating than that which my uncle had occasionally shown in the same work. What I wished was a comprehensive history of the site from its very settlement in 1636, or even before, if the Narragansett Indian legend could be unearthed to supply the data. I found at the start that the land had been part of a long strip of home lot granted originally to John Throckmorton, one of the many similar strips beginning at the town street beside the river and extending up over the hill in a line roughly corresponding with the modern Hope Street. The Throckmorton lot had later, of course, been much subdivided, and I became very assiduous in tracing that section through which Back or Benefit Street would later run. It had, a rumor indeed said, been the Throckmorton graveyard. But as I examined the records more carefully, I found that the graves had all been transferred at an early date to the North's burial ground on the Pawtucket West Road. Then suddenly I came, by a rare piece of chance, since it was not in the main body of records and might easily have been missed, upon something which aroused my keenest eagerness, fitting as it did with several of the queerest phases of the affair. Record of a lease, in 1697, of a small tract of ground to an Etienne Roulet and his wife. At last, the French element had appeared. That, and another deeper element of horror which the name conjured up from the darkest recesses of my weird and heterogeneous reading. and I feverishly studied the platting of the locality as it had been before the cutting through and partial straightening of Back Street between 1747 and 1758. I found what I had half expected, that where the Shunned House now stood, the Roulets had laid out their graveyard behind a one-story and attic cottage, and that no record of any transfer of graves existed. The document, indeed, ended in much confusion, and I was forced to ransack both the Rhode Island Historical Society and the Shepley Library before I could find a local door, which the name Etienne Roulet would unlock. In the end, I did find something of such vague but monstrous import that I set about at once to examine the cellar of the Shunned House itself with a new and excited minuteness. The Roulets, it seemed, had come in 1696 from East Greenwich, down the west shore of Narragansett Bay. They were from Cowd, and had encountered much opposition before the Providence selectmen allowed them to settle in the town. Unpopularity had dogged them in East Greenwich, whither they had come in 1686, after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and rumors said that the cause of dislike extended beyond mere racial and national prejudice, or the land disputes which involved either French settlers with the English in rivalries, which not even Governor Andros would quell. But it was their ardent Protestantism, too ardent, some whispered, and their evident distress when virtually driven from the village down the bay, had moved the sympathy of the town fathers. Here the strangers had been granted a haven, and Etienne Roulet, less apt at agriculture than at reading queer books and drawing queer diagrams, and given a clerical post in the warehouse at Pardon Tillinghast Wharf, far south in Town Street. There had, however, been a riot of some sort later on, perhaps 40 years later, after old Roulet's death, and no one seemed to hear of the family after that. For a century or more it appeared that the Roulets had been well remembered and frequently discussed as vivid incidents in the quiet life of a New England seaport. Etienne's son Paul, a surly fellow whose erratic conduct had probably provoked the riot which wiped out the family, was particularly a source of speculation. And though Providence never shared the witchcraft panics of her Puritan neighbors, it was freely intimated by old wives that his prayers were neither uttered at the proper time nor directed toward the proper object. All this had undoubtedly formed the basis of the legend known by old Maria Robbins. What relation it had to the French ravings of Roby Harris and other inhabitants of the Shunned House, imagination or future discovery alone could determine. I wondered how many of those who had known the legends realized that additional link with the terrible which my wider reading had given me. That ominous item in the annals of morbid horror which tells of the creature Jacques Rollade of Cowd, who in 1598 was condemned to death as a demonic, but afterwards saved from the stake by the Paris Parliament and shut in a madhouse. He had been found covered with blood and shreds of flesh in a wood shortly after killing and rending a boy by a pair of wolves. One wolf was seen to lope away unhurt. Surely a pretty hearthside tale, which had queer significance as to name and place, but I decided that the Providence gossips could not have generally known of it. Had they known, the coincidence of names would have brought some drastic and frightening action. Indeed, might not its limited whispering have precipitated the final riot which erased the Roulets from the town? I now visited the accursed place with increased frequency, studying in the unwholesome vegetation in the garden, examining all the walls of the building, and poring over every inch of the earthen cellar floor. Finally, with Carrington Harris's permission, I fitted a key to the disused door opening in the cellar directly upon Benefit Street, preferring to have more immediate access to the outside world than the dark stairs, ground-floor hall, and front door could give. There, where morbidity lurked most thickly, I searched and poked during the long afternoons when the sunlight filtered through the cobweb above-ground windows. and a sense of security glowed from the unlocked door, which placed me only a few feet from the placid sidewalk outside. Nothing new rewarded my efforts, only the same depressing mustiness and faint suggestions of noxious odors and nitrous outlines on the floor. And I fancy that many pedestrians must have watched me curiously through the broken panes. At length, upon the suggestion of my uncles, I decided to try the spot nocturnally. One stormy midnight, ran the beams of an electric torch over the moldy floor, with its uncanny shapes and distorted, half-phosphorescent fungi. The place had dispirited me curiously that evening, and I was almost prepared when I saw, or thought I saw, amidst the whitish deposits, a particularly sharp definition of the huddled form which I had suspected from boyhood. Its clearness was astonishing and unprecedented, and as I watched, I seemed to see again the thin, yellowish, shimmering exaltation which had started me on that rainy afternoon so many years before. Above the anthropomorphic patch of mold by the fireplace it rose, a subtle, sicklish, almost luminous vapor, which it hung trembling in the dampness, seemed to develop vague and shocking suggestions of form, gradually trailing off into nebulous decay and passing up into the blackness of the chimney with a fodor in its wake. It was truly horrible, and more so to me because of what I knew of the spot. Refusing to flee, I watched it fade, and as I watched, I felt that it was in turn watching me, greedily with its eyes more imaginable than visible. When I told my uncle about it, he was greatly aroused, and after a tense hour of reflection, arrived at a definite and drastic decision. Weighing in his mind the importance of the matter and the significance of our relation to it, he insisted that we both test, and if possible, destroy, the horror of the house by a joint night or nights of aggressive vigil in the musty and fungus-cursed cellar. Thank you once again for joining us today at the Pawtuxet General. If you would like to reach out with a question, comment, recipe, or local ghost story, our email is jess@pawtuxetgeneral.com. So drop us a line. We'd love to hear from you. But until then, I'll meet you right back here next time at the Pawtuxet General. A Something for Posterity production, pre-recorded in Pawtuxet.